Hello, my name is Ian Dean. Today we'll be looking at a tutorial on how to bake skinned meshes together and some of the special considerations that are involved with that, and how to create a prefab from the combined mesh, which is a bit tricky. So let's look at this scene. We've got these two guys running back and forth. These blocks are just the targets that they run towards. And there's a lot of draw calls here. If we look at these characters, there's actually 5 submeshes or materials on each character, plus their glasses with 2 materials, and they're carrying a sword. So each of these materials has 8 basically draw calls per guy running back and forth. So that's could definitely be optimized. So let's take a look at the procedure for doing that. It's fairly straightforward. Was very similar to the mesh baker process for everything else. So we create a new mesh baker object. We have to add these objects to that mesh baker object. The easiest way to do that is click Open Tools for adding objects. Select the root of these guys that has all the meshes we want to add selected meshes. So it'll add the meshes underneath those roots, and those have now been added. So there's 6 meshes that have been added to the list of objects to be combined. We create our empty assets for the atlas. Call it atlas. Bake materials into the combined material. So this is creating an atlas from all the textures that were on there that is going to be needed by the combined mesh. Then once I'm done this, I can bake these into a combined mesh. So I come down here. The only setting I need to set this is a little different from usual is the renderer. I set to SkinnedMeshRenderer, and then I can click bake, and we've got a new object in the scene that is the skinned mesh. So I can push. Okay, so there's the skin mesh. I can go back and disable the renderers on the source objects. And notice the draw calls drops to 3 from 19 or so. And if we push play, watch what happens. So these guys are still running back and forth just as before. It still looks pretty good. Except they're all dark. What's happened with that? Okay. Oh, that's only in the scene view in the... Okay, actually they're okay. I was just viewing it from the back side. So, yeah, they're looking all right. Okay, so now there's a couple of considerations that you have to take into account for this. So these are limitations of combining skin meshes. The source meshes must not be optimized. It's not quite clear if this is still the case. It looks like the latest versions of Unity, this actually works, but in sort of 4.2, 4.3, and earlier, that wasn't the case. You couldn't access the bones, so it would break the baking. Blend shapes are not imported. That is currently the case. This may change in the future. The limitation is Unity. It's impossible to access those parts of the mesh. Unity just hasn't provided an API for it. If Unity does do that, it's something that I will add to MeshBaker. And skinning on the GPU can be buggy, so that's in project settings, build settings, player settings. There's this GPU skinning feature. If that's turned on, it sometimes works depending on the graphics card, sometimes not. It's glitchy and can result in mangled looking meshes. So that is a factor. Now there's two other considerations that you have to take into account is you must set the mesh render or the bounds on the skin mesh renderer and the animation and culling settings. So what's this bounds on the skin mesh renderer? So see this white box in the scene here? That is the bounds of the skin mesh renderer. So if I push play, you'll see that box stay there while the characters run back and forth. Now initially the characters fit inside that box, but they're actually running in and out of it. Now if the camera does not intersect that box, then Unity will stop doing the skin meshing on those characters, and they will actually vanish out of the scene. So that's a problem when the characters are outside that box, because this guy is outside the box. If my camera were situated sort of like this, where that guy's outside the box, visible but outside the box, then that character would suddenly vanish. So how do we update or keep that this box updated? Well, luckily MeshBaker comes with a couple of scripts that will do that for you. So where are they? Scripts. Update skin mesh from bounds and update skin mesh from bones. The bones is slightly more efficient, but not perfect. So we put it on there. Which one did I grab? From bounds. Honestly, let's use the bones one, because there's the bounds one you have to put in the objects, a list of objects, but the bones one just works because that's not what I wanted. Remove component. Remove component. The bones one just works. So watch the white box. Notice how it updates itself so that it keeps the skin mesh renderers inside. Now this script actually is not free. There is a processing overhead, so you may want to tweak it so that it runs in every second or third frame, and you may also want to write your own script if there's something special about the character, the situation that you can take advantage of. And another thing you can do is you can just hard code. Remove component. Remove component. If it's a situation like this, where in your game these two characters are always going to exist in exactly this area, then you can just hard code that box by dragging these handles so that to an area that's big enough that the characters will always be inside it. So that, as I've talked about the two options for updating the render bounds, then there's the animation culling settings. So I go back to these characters. If you look at the animator, currently their culling mode is always animate. If I switch that to based on renderers, watch what happens. The animations stop. So what's that about? If you look at where these animation components are, they've got a skin mesh underneath them. And so these animation components find that skin mesh and animate based on whether or not that skin mesh is visible. But I've disabled it because it's this skin mesh, not the regular one underneath, that's actually rendering the component. Now these animators aren't smart enough to notice that. They just notice that the first skin mesh they find underneath is not visible, so they assume they're lazy, they don't have to do the animating. So there's two ways to fix it. One way is to set that to always animate, which is what we had before and obviously works. The other way is if you situate the new skin mesh so it's underneath the animator, then it will actually animate. However, that only works for one of the skin meshes that we've combined. So it's not really a solution. You may want to write your own script that will disable the animation component if the character is outside the view frustum, or when the characters aren't in sight somehow. Okay, so I've talked about that, and we've talked about the those limitations. So now what I'd like to do is show you how to prefab these characters. So this is fairly similar. So I go back to my mesh baker. I go bake, instead of bake into scene object, we go bake into prefab. So now we have to supply mesh baker with a prefab asset. This has to be in the project. So I've actually got one here. Actually, no, let me do this because there's a trick to it. If I can go create prefab, and I could try to drag this into the field, but the field won't take it because it's not a game object. So what I need to do is actually I create a game object in the scene. I drag it to that prefab, and now the prefab goes blue, and now I can drag that to that field. Okay, so we've got bake into prefab set. All the other settings are like before. I've added a new prefab. I can click bake, and what's different this time is it's actually saved the mesh as an asset in the scene. So now there's another trick that you need. So it's a good idea at this point to push play and make sure things are still working. Oops, we forgot to reset those settings to always animate. Okay, now there's a very important detail that I'm about to explain, which is, so I've got this, oh, if you look in the console, why is there nothing in the console? Oh, because the clear on play is set. Let me go bake this again. Okay, there's a warning here. Render type is SkinnedMeshRenderer. Can't create prefab until all bones have been added to the combined mesh of the new prefab. So what's happened is MeshBaker did not actually automatically update the prefab. The prefab object is still just this empty game object. To update the prefab, what we have to do is add the combined mesh to that game object and then drag that into the prefab. However, there's a problem here. We've put the combined mesh into the prefab, but it doesn't have any references to his bones. So if we try to use this prefab, so I'm going to drag a new instance of it into the scene. Let's move it over so you can see. Actually, let's disable the other one. So even though I brought this new prefab in, and even though it's got this skin mesh renderer, we're not seeing anything. And if I push play, nothing's happening. So what's going on? What's happening is the bones for that skin mesh have been lost, the references to them, because those bones are not assets. They're just scene objects. And when I created the prefab, it created an asset in the project. But these project files don't know how to reference the bones in the scene. So to fix this, what we need to do is include the bones for this. Let's enable that for the skin mesh in the prefab for the skin mesh. So the easiest way to do that is to actually drag these whole characters in here so they're part of the prefab too. So I'll go like that. So now I should have a prefab that is completely functional. So let's disable this source one. Drag the new one into the scene. Why is it still not working? Oh, it is working, but it's under the floor. There. So there is the new prefab. Now, interestingly, they're not running back and forth, and the reason is because these targets that they were running to are not part of the scene, but they are actually still animating. They're just in their idle pose. And if I actually set one of these targets, I think it would actually work. So let's actually see if we can do that. character. Um, oh wait, it's the target that needs the character. Is that right? Oh, I see. That's a disabled one. See if that works. Yeah, it's not working. Oh well, I'm not going to actually go into that now because it's not actually a key part of it. The final thing I wanted to show in the tutorial is that we can use that prefab in a new scene. So if I go into a new scene, don't save, and I drag that new prefab into the scene, game object, create a plane so they don't fall forever. Let's move this guy. What? Where'd he go? What are you doing over there? Push play. Whoa, I didn't get these guys on the plane. There's the plane. Okay. Push play. There. So that's a functional prefab with the characters in the scene. So the key point is any scripts or physics or targets or something that these characters depend on have to be included in the prefab in order for it to all work. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial. Just maybe subscribe to my YouTube channel if you want to keep up to date with other tutorials.